We speak to journalists. This time around, it's a little different. Let's tell you why. Let's take a look at South Africa and how the country is perceived beyond our borders in the wake of the recent disturbances that rocked the country. Now, the malls and other businesses were looted and vandalized, and more than 300 lives, sadly, lost in the ensuing violence. I'm joined now by David Mackenzie, international correspondent for News Network, CNN, an award-winning journalist, and William Shockey, author of Africa is a Country, prolific writer who wrote a very interesting think piece for the New York Times. Gentlemen, to both of you, thank you so much for making time to speak to us. Let me start with you, William. And I'd like for you to just take us to what you wrote in this opinion piece that you wrote in the New York Times. And I just want to extrapolate in fact, two sentences there, and you'll elaborate further. You say, the Rainbow Nation, supposed beacon of reconciliation, is falling apart. At the heart of the discord is the ruling African National Congress. Set the stage for us as we get into this conversation. Why did you write this, and what exactly are you blaming the ANC for?
First of all, thank you, Koli, for having me on the program today. I think that what I meant by that statement is that when you think of post-democratic South Africa, what it was supposed to do was, beyond giving people enfranchisement to the majority of black South Africans, it was also supposed to deliver growth and services and economic development for the majority of citizens. And after 27 years of ANC governance, unfortunately, the reality for the majority of South Africans is that that dream of economic emancipation is still not the case.
Yeah.
And so we have an African National Congress, which is still governing the country, but which is becoming undone by its internal factional battles. And this is having tremendous consequences for the country, as we bore witness to during the period of unrest.
Yeah. David, let's come to you. You've been working for CNN, and you've covered most of Africa. If my recollection is correct, you've covered or reported, I should say, on more than 30 African countries, and some of the most significant moments, whether you talk about the fall of Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe or the death of our beloved Madiba here in South Africa. Talk to us about how South Africa as a brand looks like after the week of unrest that we saw in July.
Well, Toli, thanks for having me. You know, I think it's really instructive because I read William's piece. It was excellent, and it hit the right tone for me in terms of reaching out to an international audience. What we see too often is foreign correspondents, and I'm sort of a hybrid of that as originally a South African, really sort of falling into the trap of discussing a situation or a story like the unrest in South Africa, but leaning into maybe the stereotypes or the picture that their audience might have in their head of what South Africa is. People in America, in Europe, in Asia, who we at CNN will be telling these stories to, don't follow South Africa as close as maybe I do, or of course you do, and William does. So they're checking in on the story. And obviously there was a great deal of dismay looking at the scenes of unrest unfolding in front of our camera, of Newzroom Afrika's cameras, for days. And for people, it is a sense of shock, because perhaps their mind, South Africa is Mandela. South Africa is a democratic transition. They don't necessarily know about the deep inequalities in this country, the challenges facing the ruling party and the government. And I think it's important when these large stories emerge in countries like South Africa, not to just lean on those stereotypes or those ideas people might have on South Africa, but like William did there in that piece, and I don't mean to speak for him, but certainly it helps to explain where South Africa is now and catch people up with the reality of the situation on the ground, which might not be what people think of when they think South Africa.
Yeah, we're going to talk about different themes, gentlemen, whether you talk about the country's response to COVID-19 or indeed general poverty in the country. But William, coming back to you, the shocking video footage of people looting stores, whether it be the visual images of trucks being burnt along the N3 route towards KZN, that picture, in your view, how did it look to people who have invested monies in this country and they watching from a distance, thinking about their investment?
So I think those pictures would have been incredibly alarming to people who have invested in South Africa and who are hoping for those investments to bear fruit. But I think, and building off what David has just said, I think that for some South Africans, those pictures wouldn't have been alarming, because when we think about the structural problems which continue to plague us, such as inequality and poverty, I think the scenes of destruction which were appearing on our screens, much as they had a different context and precipitating causes on this occasion, are quite familiar, I think, to a lot of South Africans, insofar as we regularly see images of infrastructure being destroyed in service delivery protests or other eruptions of violence in communities. I think that this happened to be a moment when I think everyone was paying that much more extra attention, considering the fact that the background of all of it was the arrest of former President Jacob Zuma. But I think that following South Africa closely, as all of us have been, a lot of these scenes are quite familiar.
Yeah. David, before we go to a short breather, William talks about the arrest of former President Jacob Zuma, which has been said to have triggered this unrest that we saw. When international viewers saw that image, here's a former head of state arrested, the country goes up in smoke. For a second there, I suppose international viewers watching this would have said, well, I mean, it is a country in Africa after all. Would you agree?
Well, I can't pretend to know what all the viewers are thinking, but I can say, Kholi, what is important with this story is the fact that both the scale of the destruction and unrest and looting and the lack of a response by the state in those early days, I think, was shocking to people who do see South Africa, perhaps fairly or unfairly, in a certain way maybe that they don't see certain other countries on the continent. As you said in the introduction, I've reported on many countries on the continent, and I've seen similar issues play out when it comes to factional politics in the ruling party especially. So in some ways, while the rest of the world might see South Africa as different, in many ways we're not that different into dealing with the same struggles that other countries on the continent have dealt with post-democracy and post-liberation. And I think the fact that this was spurred by a political moment and then immediately showed to the world the deep inequality that exists in this country is part of the reason there was so much focus on it. And just briefly, you know, the fact that our crew and crews from your organization, I mean, we were in Kaplahang, we were in KwaMashu, we were in Soweto, we weren't in Sandton, we weren't in Umhlanga. The structural issues of inequality in this country are pervasive. And the fact that, for me, the most tragic thing was that the looting, ultimately, the people who live in those communities will be hurt for months by this. And whatever the reason behind it, whether it was a fully organized insurrection, as the government is trying to push forward, or just a spontaneous looting based on kind of different grievances that are political, the end result is that people are out of jobs. They can't go do their banking or get their social grants from these malls in their neighborhoods. And that's really tragic. And I think while the cameras might have moved on, it really it's despairing, the impact that this will have. And this sort of lack of continued outrage, I think, is surprising to me. I would have thought that there would be more of an immediate reaction from the government to keep this in the public spotlight. Yeah. It really has been a damaging period.
Gentlemen, I'm going to ask us to pause there for a moment. When we return, we're going to ask the question, how does South Africa stack up when it comes to upholding the rule of law? I'm in conversation with CNN award-winning international correspondent David Mackenzie and acclaimed writer and author of the book Africa is a Country, William Shockey. Gentlemen, let's get back into it. Let me come to you, William, and perhaps before we talk about the rule of law in South Africa, the contradictions between the president and some of his cabinet ministers about how to define or describe what happened in that week in July. The president's words were, this was a failed insurrection. It was an attempt at overthrowing a democratically elected government. That contradiction between the president and his ministers, how did it look, in your view, to those who are watching in from outside?
So I think it would have been something which would, for outside viewers, been a testament to the extent of strife within the ruling party. I think the question of how to describe the events of unrest is going to be a political one, and I think where there are conflicting descriptions, that reflects underlying and deeper political disagreement. And I think what that ultimately comes down to is that within the ruling party, I think there are those who are keen on dealing a heavier hand on people who are associated with the capture of the state, as we call it here, and the deep patronage and corruption that has built up over the years. And there are others who perhaps want to have a much more conciliatory approach and who therefore want to perhaps describe what happened in, let's say, less charged terms. So I think for outside viewers, it would be surprising to see South African government be so out of step with each other internally. And I think that inside South Africa, we have a better view of what those causes are.
David, despite the chaos that resulted after Zuma was sent to jail, the fact of the matter is that the rule of law in South Africa remains. Is that how you think those who have power and those who see us still in the eyes of a nation that is constantly reminding the world about why South Africa perhaps is special, and that is that we have a Madiba in this country who stands up at any moment whenever there is disagreement? People constantly go back and say, we are a country of Madiba, that international icon. Do you think that that's how the world views us, despite our follies?
It's hard to say. I do think it's crucially important what you bring up, Chloe, that the fact that former President Zuma did go to prison, just that in and of itself is hugely important. Now, unfortunately, it might be that the scenes of unrest and looting is what sticks in the mind's eye of the casual viewer and follower of South Africa. But I think in the corridors of power and possible investment and government partners to South Africa, the fact that the former president physically went to a prison cell, even if it was through kind of procedural contempt route, that is very important. In all of my reporting across the African continent and also parts of Asia, it is very rare for a former ruler, a key member of the liberation movement like President Zuma is and was, to go to prison. So it's a pivotal moment potentially for South Africa. I think what happens next is what is crucial. I think the attempts by the government and the judicial system to in fact, move through the legal process on prosecuting other people who are allegedly involved in very deep, very extensive corruption, that will be the true test. But in a way, if you can take anything positive from the very dark few weeks in July, it's that justice did prevail in the sense that even though he denies the allegation, President Zuma went to a prison cell.
Yeah. William, and that question is crucial, isn't it? What happens next is perhaps going to be the determinant. You are a person who writes almost in a forward-looking manner. In your view, what is going to happen next for our country?
It's hard for me to speculate as to what happens next. Absolutely agree that that is going to be decisive. I think what we will start to see is the ruling party escalating its campaign to try and stamp out corruption internally. I think another shocking revelation that happened just before Zuma's arrest was the details of how our health minister was implicated in an improper deal and how he was suspended whilst investigations were ongoing. And I think that itself was a sign of how it seems that within the ruling party there is an effort beyond factions, which I think is noteworthy, to try and stamp out corruption. And I think that is likely to continue. But I think another positive that one could possibly take away from this is I think this was a big shock to many. And I think what that means is a lot of South Africans, I think, are now thinking seriously ahead of local government elections, which are postponed to early next year.
Yeah.
And they're thinking seriously about how, as South Africans, they can mobilize in order to make themselves heard and in order to demand the necessary deep structural changes that the country requires in order to craft a situation that works for everyone.
Yeah. David, I want to come to you. And as I mentioned earlier, we were going to talk about the various themes during this discussion. You did a fantastic story covering the COVID-19 situation in the country. In particular, you were looking at the COVID-19 wards, completely overwhelmed. I think it was a hospital in the Eastern Cape province. William refers to the issue of corruption within the governing party being one of the major headaches for this administration. Your view, just watching that situation playing itself out at that hospital, and if you cast your mind to the allegations that we've seen around PPE corruption, right now you have the health minister currently on special leave as a result of allegations of corruption.
Well, I think it's a very complicated picture to assess the COVID-19 response in South Africa. I think everyone, and I myself included, was very impressed with the swift action taken by the government in the early days of the pandemic. You had very tough choices that were made to lock down the nation, to really batten down the hatches, as it were. South Africa also used its public health experience with HIV/AIDS to mobilize, to educate, and to move into communities. But like many governments and countries around the world, there have been issues. Well, corruption is one of them. We covered specifically a housing project that was for people who were trying to socially distance, that appeared to have wide-scale corruption. There have been all the PPE deals, 40 million rand, I think it is, in just one province alone, allegedly is being looked into. I think it speaks to the overall issue, not just with COVID-19, of the endemic corruption in this country, that has hobbled the governance and ultimately impacted individual people. Corruption is not a victimless crime. You can see the impact of it every single day with nurses and doctors maybe unable to get PPE, crucial times of the first and second wave, and people just losing faith in the government. But it is a mixed response. We did some very tough reporting on South African COVID response when it came to what looked like a slow procurement of vaccines. that system has changed quite substantially over the last few weeks, and that is ramping up. So credit where it is due. But just very briefly, specifically, the one report we did on a hospital here in Gauteng, which I can't name specifically, spoke to the difficult circumstances, impossible circumstances that doctors and nurses were dealing with in the third wave. And what I found surprising in reporting on this country more extensively maybe than I have in the past is the difficulty to access these public or private hospitals to show the public how bad it is, which is a very significant part of a public health response, is so people don't pretend that COVID is not serious. And we had a huge amount of trouble for months to try and get that access. And I know my colleagues, both in local and international press, had the same. So we had to sort of get footage and interview anonymously doctors. And I do think it's worth a rethink in terms of engaging with the press in South Africa to allow it to fulfill its role in the public health debate and just letting people know how bad it is and to be careful.
Yeah. William, how important is that there is transparency, which is what I think David is talking to? Why is it that the South African government has been almost scared to allow full access so that people can realize that COVID-19 is indeed very much alive and it does kill people?
I think the reasons for their fear is, as you've both touched on, which is that once people know the extent of how bad it is, then I think that will reflect poorly on government if its response hasn't been adequate to address the extent of the problem. I think that the pandemic in general has been a crucial test for governments who have to balance both the responsibility to try and manage the behaviors of populations to get them to comply with regulations, restrictions, and so on, while at the same time respecting the autonomy and civil liberties of populations and treating them as capable of coming to their own informed conclusions about what is happening around them. And the only way citizens can come to informed conclusions about what is happening around them is if the media, as David is saying, is capable of fulfilling its role in communicating that information and is given transparent access to the places where that information resides.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of governments are worried that once you open the floodgates and there is full transparency, then that's going to, I think, cause citizens to hold them to stronger account. And once they're held to stronger accounts, I think that means political costs. And those political costs, I think, are something that the government doesn't necessarily want to risk at the moment, whilst its hold on power continues to be fragile and continues to be tested extensively.
Yeah. David, we hold this mantle of being the gateway, or Africa's gateway, or the gateway of Africa into the continent. Do you think that image somehow has been battered during this past unrest? Is that going to be shaken a little bit, or are we still going to hold on to that position of being seen as the gateway into Africa?
Well, I mean, I'd almost dispute that South Africa is seen within the African context as the gateway to the continent. Certainly from a point of view of investment from non-Africans into the continent, given the sophistication of our economy, yes, you're right, it is a gateway. But, you know, if you travel to Kenya or Tanzania or Nigeria, there's a much more cynical viewpoint, possibly, about South Africa and South Africans. And part of that has been born out of the hideous xenophobic attacks that have occurred in this country for several years. And so there is maybe a bleaker picture right now amongst the rest of the continent. We're not, this isn't the era of Thabo Mbeki's, Africanism, Pan-Africanism. Post that administration, you really saw the South African government look inwards and be more interested in its own politics, probably understandably. But I think a lot of work needs to be done, and this is not me preaching, I just think it's in South Africa's interest to reconnect with the rest of the African continent. And we need them as much as they need us, frankly, in terms of commerce, trade, people exchange, and just a general openness with the rest of the continent. So, yes, I think that this unrest would have damaged that opinion of South Africa. But unfortunately, I think some of the damage has already been done, and a lot of work needs to be done to improve those relationships and become a more obvious gateway to the rest of the continent.
Gentlemen, it has been a worthy discussion indeed. Thank you very much for your insights and indeed your views about how we, South Africa, are seen by the world. David McKenzie is CNN's international correspondent, and William is a writer and a prolific author as well. William talking to us about the image that our country has somehow managed to get out there about the events that we saw in the past week. What a terrible image it is, and hopefully it can be reversed.